Okay, and welcome back, students taking Math for Business and Finance and Math Applications. And we're working on the theory videos for the Chapter 22, the Business Statistics. And we're dealing with the standard deviation. Okay, so a couple of videos ago, I presented this here 6-step process. And let me just erase all of this, because if you watch that particular video, you'd have all of this information, and that was just me giving a very, very simplistic example. But what we're going to do is, in this video, is we're going to apply these 6 steps to this set of data, okay, which is what we covered in the last video, right? Now, when we're applying it to this set of data, right, this is that same exact illustration from this slide, okay? All right, I've just shrunk it down a little bit so that I can put these illustrations from the textbook, here, so that we can work through the information, okay? All right, in order to be able to calculate the standard deviation, right? So, in following these here steps, and that's what we're going to do, is we're going to work through these steps to calculate the deviation, standard deviation for both data set A and data set B, right? Step number 1, it said find the mean of the set of data, okay? So we had done that in the previous video. We had found the mean for both sets of data. That was, that came out to 6. Okay, so go back to the previous video if you don't understand why the mean is 6. Okay, so we're going to say the mean is equal to 6. I mean, you just can't see it as well right here. Okay, so the mean is 6. Now, step number 2, it says subtract the mean from each piece of data to find the deviation. Okay, so when we were looking at our data, all right, remember this is divided in 2. Okay, we have A over here and B over here. So this here is A and this over here is B. So we're going to work through A first. Right, with A, we had the data showed a 1, a 2, a 5, a 10, and a 12. So that's my data right there, a 1, a 2, a 5, a 10, and a 12. And step number 2 says we take our data and we subtract our mean. So my data was a 1, and I subtract the mean of 6, and that gives me a -5. I take my second point in data as a 2, I subtract the 6, and I get a -4. I take the 5 minus 6, that gives me a -1. I take the 10 minus 6, that gives me 4, and I take the 12 minus 6, that gives me 6. Right? So that's step number 2, subtract the mean from each piece of data to find the deviation. Step number 3 says square each deviation, which means multiply each deviation by itself. The illustration here shows step 3, okay? It says the data minus the mean squared, okay? So this is the data. Let me erase that so you can get a better look at it. This is the data minus the mean, okay? And notice that for step 3, we're repeating the same exact thing, except we're squaring it right here, okay? So whatever you get for this answer here from the data minus the mean, you're going to square it. And squaring just simply means multiplying that number by itself. So if I have a -5 as my first piece of data, as my first deviation from that piece of data, I have a -5. Well, if you take a minus in your calculator, you hit -5 times a -5, you end up with you end up with 25. Okay, remember, if you're multiplying when it comes to multiplication, right? So let's talk about squaring just for a second. Squaring. Okay, if you have a number and you square it, that's what this little superscript means, it squares. What you're doing is you're taking that number and you're multiplying it by itself, okay? And in the case of a 5, we end up with 5 times 5 is a 25, okay? Now here's the thing. if this was a minus 5, okay, well then a minus 5 times a minus 5 is still going to give us 25. Why? Because when you multiply one negative number by another negative number, you end up with a positive number. Okay, so if you have a positive number and you multiply it by a positive number, okay, you end up with a positive number. If you have a negative number and multiply it by a negative number, you end up with a positive number. If you get my eraser, if you have a positive number and you multiply it by a negative number, okay, you end up with a negative number. That's, that's the way that works. So whenever I'm squaring these numbers, even though this is a minus 5 and I'm going to square it, all I need to do is think, because it's a minus, right? I'm going to end up with a positive number. So I just take 5 times 5 and get 25. And if you notice, all of these numbers are positive numbers. Okay, why? Because a minus times a minus is a plus. A minus times a minus is a plus. A plus times a plus is a plus. And a plus times a plus is a plus. Okay, so all you really need to do when you're squaring here, and this is not that difficult, okay, you're taking your answer from step number 2, this minus 5, and you take 5 times 5, and you get 25. You take the minus 4, so it's 4 times 4, and you get 16. You take the minus 1, 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 4 is 16. 6 times 6 is 36. Okay, so that's step number 3. Right? Let me go back up to here, and now we've done step number 3. All right, so we've squared each deviation. Now for step number 4, we're going to sum all of the squared deviations, meaning we're going to add them all up. All right, so what we had just gotten, for these numbers here, we're going to add them all up, and we end up with 94, which is step number 4 here. Okay, all we're doing is adding them all up. Right? Now, step number 5 says divide the sum of the squared deviations by n minus 1. Okay, n minus 1, where n equals the number of the pieces of data. Okay, so in our case, the number of pieces of data, was 5, right? We have, 1 piece, 2 pieces, 3, 4, we have 5 pieces of data. So we're going to take the 94 and we're going to divide it by n minus 1. Well, if n is 5, n minus 1 is equal to 4. So we're going to take 94 and divide it by the 4. Okay, so as you can see for step 5 over here, divide n minus 1. So 94 is over the 5 minus 1 because the n had the 5 pieces of data. So 94 divided by 4 gives me 23.5. That's step number 5. Okay, so I'm at the end of step number 5, I have 23.5. Now we jump back up and we look at step number 6. And it says find the square root of the number obtained in step 5. Okay, and this ends up being the standard deviation. So with at the end of step 5, we have 23.5. Okay, it says here step 6, the square root, and this is the square root symbol. Okay, that's the square root symbol. The square root of 23.5 is equal to 4.8. So if you punched that into your calculator, meaning you went and hit the numbers 23.5, and then you hit the square root key, it would give you 4.8 as your standard deviation. Okay, that's your answer, and that would be the standard deviation. So the standard deviation of data set A is 4.8. Okay, so I walked through that step by step, and I'm actually at 10 minutes. Okay, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to erase some of this. Actually, I'm not going to erase any of that. I'll erase this. And I'm going to walk through the data set B, but I'm not going to bounce back and forth between the previous slide and this one to follow the steps. I'm just going to actually work through the data. And like I said, I don't memorize the I don't memorize the formula. Okay. If I want to find out the standard deviation, I actually go to a textbook and look at the formula, and I understand how the formula, what the formula is based upon. This textbook is not giving you that formula. When you get to the business statistics or any statistics, you will see the formula for standard deviation. But working through that formula is working through this six-step process. Okay, so, and I'm going to use blue here. Okay, so for B, all right, for data set B, the first thing we do is we have to find the mean. Okay, and for data set B, we found the mean to be 6. Why? Because I had, I look at my data points. I had 4 plus 4 plus 5 plus 8 plus 9, which is what's here. Okay, I'm going to add those all up, and then I'm going to divide by however many points of data. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points of data. Okay, so when I'm doing this, I have 8, 13, 21, 30 is what's, when I add all of these data points up, and I'm going to divide by 5, and that gives me my average or my mean of 6. Okay, so my mean is 6. Now, that was step 1, right? I've listed all of my data here, 4, 4, 5, 8, and 9. Remember, I'm adding those all up. That gives me 30, and I divide by 5 because there's 5 of them, and that gives me 6 as a mean. Okay, but when you're working through this, you can actually do what I just did. This is 30, and then divide by 5 and make that 6 as my mean, and call this the mean. Okay, so now step number 2 is I take my data point and I subtract the mean. Okay, so I have 4 as a data point, I subtract 6, and I get a minus 2. 4 minus 6 is 2. This 5 minus 6 is a minus 1. 8 minus 6 is a 2, and 9 minus the 6 is a 3. Okay. Now that I have that, okay, step number 3, I square these numbers, right? So I have a minus 2, and I'm going to square it. A minus 2, I'm going to square it. A minus 1, I'm going to square it. 2 squared and 3 squared, okay? That's what I'm doing for step number 3. I'm just squaring those numbers. And squaring those numbers means multiplying, the number by itself. Well, when I take a minus 2 times a minus 2, I end up with a positive 4. Okay? Minus 2 times a minus 2 gives me a 4. A minus 1 times a minus 1 gives me 1. 2 times 2 gives me a 4. And 3 times 3 gives me 9. Okay, so that's all I'm doing for step 3 is squaring it. Now, for step number 4, I'm going to add up everything in step number 3. Okay, so 4 plus 4 plus 1 plus 4 plus 9 gives me 22. Okay, that's what I did for step number 4. All it is just the sum of those. Right? Now, for step number 5, I'm going to divide what I have from step number 4 by n minus 1. Right? So I have 22, and I'm going to divide by n minus 1. The thing I need to know is, what n is. Well, n is 5 because I have 5 data points here. Okay, so 5 minus 1, that's 4. So now I have 22, and I'm dividing it by 4, which is what you see right here. And that gives me 5.5. Okay, so that's the end of step number 5. And then to go on to step number 6, I take that 5.5 and I take the square root of it. Okay. Now I'm not going to go through the math of doing a square root. Okay. You can go and look up the math on how to do a square root. You're better off using a calculator or an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. Every basic calculator has a square root key on it. So you just punch in your 5.5 and you hit the square root key, and it gives you, in my case, it came out to 2.3452. Okay, and so they just rounded it off to 2.3. Okay, and so that's your standard deviation for data set B is 2.3. Okay, right. So between the last video of me working through the previous video to that, where I went through the steps, I went through a very simplistic set of data, and now in this video we've actually went through two different sets of data, and I showed how to calculate the standard deviation for both of those. Remember, we had data set A and data set B, and even though the mean was the same, meaning the average was the same, the dispersion was different and the frequency was different between the two different sets of data, even though we had 5 data points and the mean was an average of 6. We were able to calculate the standard deviation for A, which means what came out to 4.8, and the standard deviation for B came out to 2.3. Right? And we went through all of those steps. So if you're not getting it, you definitely have to go back. Let's see here. You have to go back 1, 2, 3. This is the third video on standard deviation. So you have to go back to the other two and watch all 3 of these videos in tandem, one after another, so that you can grasp the whole concept, and watch them several times if you have to. But if you're still missing something and you're still not understanding something, then it's most likely one of 2 things. One, you didn't understand a previous concept, like the idea of how to calculate a mean, or you're not following along through the process here, because the math is still very simple. This is, except for punching out the square root, really it's just addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Okay, there's nothing magical about this, but you have to follow the steps in order to arrive at the correct answer. Okay, but if you're still not getting it, definitely feel free to call and speak with an instructor, and they'll be happy to speak with you. All right. Now, in the next video, we are going to cover the normal distribution of the data set. I mean, why did we calculate a standard deviation? Right. Remember, that's one of our measures of distribution. Of dispersion. And we can see that in our normal distribution. So we'll cover normal distribution in the next video.